I have read in some books that the historical Paul is totally different from the Paul who is recounted in Acts. This is the Paul of Luke. The historical Paul is the one that we find in his letters. It is also mentioned that Acts is historically unreliable and it has many metaphors. How would you respond to this objection?
I'm not sure it's got a lot of metaphors. Yeah, there seems to be some tensions between Paul, on occasion, between Paul, what Paul says in his letters, and the book of Acts. These aren't major tensions. A lot of them have to do with the chronology, and it may very well be the case that Luke has reworked some of the chronology to make for a better narrative. I don't know. I haven't specialized in that. You may want to ask Craig Keener, since he's written over 5,000 or I think 4,500 pages in his commentary on Acts where he investigates these things, okay? But
Right.
that seems to me to be a non-issue when it comes to the resurrection, because we don't even need Acts on it. We can just use Paul's undisputed letters. For example, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, and Galatians. You could just use those. And Romans, and get a very strong case for the resurrection just from those undisputed letters of Paul. So to say that the book of Acts has some tensions with Paul's letters at times, that's just a red herring. It's a rabbit trail that has no relevance to the resurrection of Jesus.
It's interesting, because I'm going to interview Dr. Kinner, so I can talk with him more about Acts.
Craig Keener is just an amazing scholar. He just blows my mind. He is just a scholar's scholar. He's on the top shelf, and it's like when it comes to New Testament scholarship, it's almost like he's in a league all by himself. He's really quite an amazing scholar.
I also watched the conversation between you guys. It was great.
Oh, the fly on the wall thing. Yeah, that was fun. Well, stay tuned to that. We have another guest, friend of mine, coming on starting Monday, and there will be 4 episodes with that. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm super fan of your show.
And then later on this year, I have F.F. Bruce's last doctoral student that I sit down and talk with. He was my Greek professor, just an amazing man.
So maybe I can translate your videos for people here in Latin America.
Sure, you bet.
Well, continuing with the questions, for someone to be resurrected, he has to be dead. And I think we have enough evidence for that. But did Jesus really die on a cross? I mean, we have, for example, Islam that denies this.
Well, we have good evidence that he did. Number one, you do have the Christian sources, which even with those, you have multiple independent sources with Mark, with John, with Paul. I mean, all over in the New Testament, all independent sources. Some of them are quite early, like Mark and Paul, rooted in eyewitness testimony, the Gospels plus Paul. Well, we don't know if Paul was an eyewitness to Jesus's execution. He could have been, but we don't know that for sure. But you certainly have the Gospels that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. You have unsympathetic sources such as Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara bar Serapion, who all attest to Jesus's execution by the Romans and his death by their hands. You've got the fact that the medical implications of scourging, the torture that preceded crucifixion and then crucifixion itself, that it's extremely unlikely that a person would survive crucifixion. In fact, we only have one record from antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion. In that case, it comes from Josephus, and he reports that during the war against the Jews at Jerusalem, up when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, just before that happened, Josephus reports that he saw 3 of his friends who had been crucified. And so Josephus went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and requested as a favor to him that he spare the lives of his 3 friends. So out of friendship to Josephus, Titus ordered that all 3 of Josephus's friends be removed from their crosses and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. In spite of this, 2 of the 3 still died. So even if Jesus had been removed prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival were very, very small. And on top of that, we don't have a scrap of evidence that Jesus survived his crucifixion, that he was removed from his cross prematurely, or provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. We also have to consider that even if Jesus had survived his crucifixion and was able to appear to his disciples afterward, what would he have looked like just a few days later? He would have been still having been scourged. He would have been and then crucified. He wouldn't have been able to stand. He would have been dehydrated, in horrific medical condition, horrific health. In such a state, he would not have been able to convince his disciples that he had been raised from the dead in a resurrection body. Alive, yes, but resurrected, no way. All right, so you have that problem. Muslims say that in the Quran, Surah 4, verses 156 through 58, that God only made it appear that Jesus died, but God rescued him and took him to heaven. So the problem with this is that we can see that Jesus actually predicted his imminent death, that he was going to die within a very short period of time, not a few thousand years from then after he returned, like the Quran says, but that he was going to die very soon. I've written on this. It's on. I've got a copy of that on my website. It's in my large book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, where I really go in depth with it. I have a shorter version of it in my book, Paul Meets Muhammad. But we can show historically that Jesus predicted his death. Now, this creates a very difficult problem for Islam. You see, if Jesus predicted his death and he died as he predicted, well, then the Quran is mistaken, because it says only God made it appear that he died. But if Jesus predicted his death and he did not die, well, that would make him a false prophet. But the Quran says that Jesus was a true prophet of God. So if Jesus did not die, then the Quran is mistaken as well. In either case, the Quran is mistaken about what happened to Jesus and should not be trusted. Another thing we could say is, we could understand how God might say he's going to go ahead and deceive the Romans and the Jews, who were Jesus's enemies and that had him crucified. But why would he deceive his disciples into believing that Jesus had been raised from the dead? And then allow the disciples to go around proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus, forming a foundation for a false religion and Islam's greatest competitor. That seems that would be very unwise of God to do that. Moreover, the Quran refers to the disciples of Jesus as Muslims. And so if God is going to, we could see where he would deceive the Jewish leadership and the Romans, but why would he deceive Jesus' followers, Muslims? And if he deceived those Muslims, then I'd say to the Muslim, how do you know that he's not deceiving you right now? You just couldn't. So the Muslim objection against the death of Jesus it fails. It fails terribly. So there's no reason to trust the Quran on this. We have every reason to believe that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him.
And that will make Christianity true against Islam?
Well, the death of Jesus wouldn't make Christianity true. If Jesus died by crucifixion, it would only render Islam to be false. Okay? It's the resurrection that proves Christianity to be true, and also likewise proves Islam to be false.
Great. Now, did Jesus work miracles while he was alive? I mean, we have this evidence in the Bible, the New Testament, but we have other evidence for that? We can believe as a rational people that Jesus lived, but did he make miracles while he was alive?
Sure. I mean, look, what do historians do in order to determine if something in the past happened? How do we determine that Caesar crossed the Rubicon? How do we determine that Antony loved Cleopatra? we look at that through things such as, are there multiple independent sources that reported? Are these sources early? Are they rooted in eyewitness testimony? Do we have unsympathetic sources? When we come to the Gospels, we've got Jesus' miracles reported in multiple independent sources, sources rooted in eyewitness testimony. Some of them are early, like Mark. So they appear. In fact, Jesus' miracles appear in every layer of the gospel tradition. Mark, Q, M, L, John. It's in Josephus. He mentions Jesus' astonishing deeds. It's, in fact, Jesus' miracles appear in multiple literary forms. So we've got good reason to think that. Moreover, as Craig Keener has shown in his 2-volume set on miracles, and as many Christians have seen over the years, myself included, miracles occur even today. And if miracles occur today, that increases the plausibility that they occurred back then, especially when we take the context of who Jesus was, God's uniquely divine Son.
Now, what I see commonly is that people say that the historical Jesus is totally different from the Jesus of faith. How would you respond to this?
I had a debate with John Dominic Crossan, who has claimed this for some time. It was in October 2018, and your viewers can watch that debate on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, type in my name, Mike Licona, and you'll see my channel. It's got over 200 videos, and you'll just have to go a couple pages back, and it's, again, October 2018, where we talk about the historical Jesus. When we talk about the historical Jesus, it's important to distinguish the historical Jesus from the real Jesus. The historical Jesus is the Jesus that we can prove using the tools of historians. Now, think of it this way. If I walk into a graveyard and I see a gravestone, it will mention the person's name, their birthday, and the date of their death. It might also say something else about them: loving husband, loving wife, something like that, had survived by this spouse and how many children they had. Or maybe this person was a soldier in a certain war. All right, so, but it's just a little bit of information. Now, the person that's buried there's a whole lot more to that person's life than is written on that tombstone. Okay. And in fact, if we wrote a biography of that person, there'd be certain things that would be reports about that person, which may be true, may be false. We just couldn't prove them. There would be things that we could prove and things that may be true, but we can't prove. The historical Jesus is kind of similar. The real Jesus, who walked and lived in Judea in the 1st century, said certain things, did certain things, was a certain kind of person. And we don't have everything that he did and said reported in the Gospels. All right. So we're looking for what we can prove about Jesus, and that Jesus is what's called the historical Jesus. He's a little different from the real Jesus, who is much more than the historical Jesus, just like the person buried in the ground was much more than what's recorded them, what can be known of them from looking at their tombstone. The Christ of faith is the Christ that we find in the Gospels. So the task of the historian is to determine or assess whether the Christ that we find in the Gospels is the same, it lines up with the historical Jesus. And I have not found that the Christ of faith is in contradiction to the historical Jesus. But the Christ of faith is more than what we have in the historical Jesus, because we cannot prove that Jesus was born of a virgin. We cannot prove that his death atones for sins. That's something a historian cannot prove. We cannot prove, as historians, using the tools of historians, that Jesus existed in the form of God prior to coming to earth. And we cannot prove, as a historian, that Jesus is in heaven right now. We can only prove certain things that the tools of historians will allow us to do. So I explained this in my debate with Crossan, if someone would like to see that.
Great. Thanks for the answer, Dr. Licona. I recently translated a series of articles on the historicity of Jesus, and I'll get comment on this objection. Now, moving to another question, what evidence do we have for the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea?
For the burial by Joseph. Okay. So
Yeah.
we don't really only have what's reported in the Gospels, the burial by Joseph. It's also, we can see that it's certainly in alignment with, the story is in alignment with what we would expect of that period. The Romans, they're typically, what they would do after crucifying an individual is they just allow them to stay on the cross for days, even after they had died, so that scavengers such as birds and dogs could just pick away at the corpse, and insects would eat away at the corpses. Finally, the corpse would be removed from the cross, thrown into a pit where other criminals had been buried in a shallow grave, and then the dogs and scavengers and vultures and insects could feed off of those bodies as well. But the Romans, typically, when they conquered a people, they would allow that nation, that culture, to maintain some of its cultural practices in order to maintain peace and avoid riots and further war and contention, disturbances, political disturbances with those people. And so in Deuteronomy, in the Old Testament, it talks about, I think it's Deuteronomy 21:23, where it says that a person who is hung on a tree should not remain there until after sunset, but they should be given a proper burial prior to sunset. We can see that in Alexandria, Egypt, which was a different culture, of course, than what we had in Jerusalem, that Flaccus, the Roman governor there, allowed for Jews to be removed from their crosses prior to sunset during a holiday. But in Jerusalem, we have reasons to believe that that was the standard there, because, of course, the Jews would have thought that had a person remained on the cross after sunset, it would have defiled their land, and then you would have had real problems with the Romans. The Romans would have had real problems with the Jews at that point. So we have good reasons to think that the Romans allowed the Jews to remove the criminals from the crosses and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. We find this not only mentioned by Josephus in his Jewish War, Book 4, Section 317. There he talks about how some Roman mercenaries hired by the Romans, went into Jerusalem just prior to the temple's destruction in the year 70. So we're probably looking around the year 67, 68. They went in, they killed a bunch of Jews, and they would not allow them to be buried. And it said the Jews were very angry because it was their custom up to that point to remove the dead from their crosses and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So Josephus there is basically saying the Romans allowed for this proper burial prior to sunset, that the Romans had made an exception for them. We also have the remains of crucified victims in ossuaries discovered in Jerusalem. Now, an ossuary was a bone box. And so this was a practice that occurred from around the year 30 BC all the way up to the temple's destruction in 70, so about 100 years worth. They would bury a person in a tomb. They would come back a year later after the body had decomposed, collect the bones, put them in a small box made of stone, and then give that box a proper burial. And they have discovered over 1,000 of these in Jerusalem. And a few of them contained the bones of crucified victims. In one case, they found a nail still lodged in his ankle bone. So they know he had been crucified. So we know that this had happened prior to the year 70 in Jerusalem. We have archaeological evidence of a crucified, more than one actually, crucified victim that had received a proper burial. So the story of Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus, giving him a proper burial, it has historical verisimilitude. It fits right in and it's plausible given our background knowledge of the burial practices, even of the condemned and crucified of that time. The fact that it's multiply attested in the Gospels by Mark and John, at least, would give good reason to think that Joseph, the burial by Joseph, is historically accurate.
Now, I would like to touch on two questions regarding the resurrection. Could you explain to us what the hallucination theory is about and whether it is a valid objection or not?
Well, hallucinations, let's talk about what a hallucination is. A hallucination is a false sensory perception. You believe you are perceiving something with your natural senses, but that thing is not actually there. So you can have a visual hallucination where you think you see something, but that thing is not there. Or you can have an auditory hallucination where you think you hear something, but that thing is like someone calling you, or music, but that music or that person calling you is not actually there. You could have a sense of smell, taste, the sense of touch. This can happen like if you have a cell phone, a mobile phone, and when you first get it, you put it on vibrate when you know you're going into a meeting. And in the middle of the meeting, you have this perception that you think you just got a text message because it vibrated, and you pull it out and nope, it was a false alarm. That didn't happen. You anticipated something, and that caused a hallucination. Then there's a sense of motion, and most of us have had this kind of a hallucination when we are dreaming, and we dream that we are falling and we wake up. That is a hallucination, okay? So most of us will experience a hallucination of some sort during our lifetime. Only 7% of those who are most likely to experience a hallucination giving the death of a loved one, only 7% of them experience a visual hallucination. So think about this. Our reports from Paul and from the Gospels inform us that all of Jesus' disciples believed that they had an experience in which the risen Jesus had appeared to them. Appeared, that's visual. So that's not 7%, that's an unthinkable 100%. Moreover, because hallucinations are false sensory perceptions, they're like dreams. They're going on in your head, but no one else is experiencing your hallucination. So like in a dream, I could not dream and say to my wife, I wake up in the middle of the night and say, Debbie, I'm having a dream that I'm in Peru. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream, and we can both look at and see what Peru's like. All right. That's not going to happen. We might both go back to sleep and dream we're in Peru, but we're not in the same dream. We're not having the same dream, because a dream has no external reality. It's in our head only. Same thing with a hallucination. A hallucination is a false sensory perception. It's in our head only. So you can't have group hallucinations. And yet we've got multiple appearances of Jesus to groups that's mentioned not only in the Gospels, but also in Paul's writings, in oral tradition that can be traced back likely to Jesus' apostles in Jerusalem. You can look and you can say, well, wait a minute, Paul was an enemy of the church too. And he believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. He wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. And then we do have good evidence for an empty tomb, and hallucinations do not account for the empty tomb. So these are just a number of the reasons why the hallucination hypothesis fails to account for the known data, historical data that can be known.
There is another topic that is talked about a lot in social medias. Is the story of the resurrection a copy of other ancient cultures?
Well, I've got a couple of videos. One you will probably be translating that came out last month. That's just a real short, couple minutes long, on my YouTube channel. But on my YouTube channel, I have a full lecture that goes for a while, where I give a number of reasons why we can be confident that the Christians did not copy off of pagan myths about dying and rising gods. I'll just give you a couple reasons here. Number one, consider who the earliest Christians were. They were pious Jews who were debating over matters of the Jewish law, such as whether Jewish what Gentile male Christians needed to be circumcised, whether Christians could eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, whether Jewish Christians were even allowed to eat in the same room as Gentile Christians. Now, if you're going to have these kinds of sensitivities to the Jewish law as a Christian, do we really anticipate that these same Christian leaders are going to engage in wholesale borrowing from pagan myths to form the foundation of their own beliefs? Of course not. Second, you can find parallel details in just about anything. So many of us here in the United States are aware, we're familiar with the story of a plane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning. And just after 10 a.m., it flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everyone on board. Well, maybe you think that I'm referring to the 767 flying into the South Tower on 9/11, but actually I'm referring to the B-25 that flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945. That actually happened. There are photographs of the aftermath that you can see online. So, I mean, it goes to the exact same floors that the one plane flew into the South Tower on 9/11. But we wouldn't look at that and say, well, because there are similarities, that the story about 9/11 was a copycat of the story of the B-25 flying into the Empire State Building decades earlier. No, coincidences happen. And we can name several of these things. So what the skeptic has to do is show that there are more than just coincidences, that these were designed and invented in this sense, that there's a causal connection, and they're unable to do that. I could go on and on. I'll just give you one more. I think that we should expect stories of dying and people coming back from the dead, and we should expect it peppered throughout all of human history. Now, here's why I say this. Some of the most popular movies and novels that are written today are romance novels or movies that involve romance. Most of them are fictitious, but that doesn't mean that people cannot experience romance. Most people can experience romance during their lifetime. Most people do. Okay? Well, why fictitious movies, fictitious novels? Because that just shows that romance is an appetite that we crave, that it's something that we can never get enough of. All right, so we see fictitious stories of romance. Well, life throughout human history, for the most part, has been brutal. Today, in Western society, life is a lot easier than it has been in the past, or in some other third world countries today. So when people were experiencing bad times or they lost a loved one, they wanted to know that this life isn't all there is, that the brutalities and the horrors that people faced in this life was not all there was to life, that there was an afterlife where God would call into account the wicked and make them pay for their wickedness, where God would reward goodness, righteousness, and that there was an afterlife where we would see those we had loved who had died, we would see them again. So given that, we would expect to find stories invented throughout all of human history of people coming back from the dead. But that doesn't negate stories of Jesus rising from the dead if there's good evidence for it, especially given Jesus' claims about who he was. He's God's uniquely divine son that God had sent down to inaugurate his kingdom here on earth and provide a way of salvation to reconcile us to God. If that's the case, and we have good evidence for Jesus' resurrection, well, the fact that we have fictitious accounts of people returning from the dead no more negates the good evidence than the fact that there are fictitious stories about romance negates the fact that authentic romance exists today.
Since we have talked about the historical reliability of the Gospels, what can you tell me about the errors in the Gospels regarding the resurrection? In a few words, of course, because I know you could talk a lot about it.
Yes, I've written a whole book on this called "Why Are There Differences in the Gospels?" It was published by Oxford University Press, and I go through and look at the resurrection narratives in a lot of detail. I think that almost all of the differences between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John on the resurrection narratives can be quite easily reconciled by recognizing that the gospel authors used various literary devices, things that we use in our ordinary conversations today too. Like, I might know that there are several people at the tomb, but I may only mention the person who announced that Jesus was risen and that he was no longer in the tomb. That we would call literary spotlighting, but we do these things in our everyday conversations today. I think that almost all of them can be accounted for this way. There are a few that I think resist these kinds of things, and I don't know what's going on. For example, where did Jesus first meet Mary Magdalene? According to John's gospel, it was at the tomb. But according to Matthew, it says Mary Magdalene and another Mary are running away from the tomb. So I think that Matthew probably compressed his account and conflated two accounts together, two visits to the tomb. But it's just hard to say. This is just speculation on my part. But in any sense, it doesn't negate the report that Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene. At the very most, it might suggest that one of those accounts that there's a discrepancy and that one of those accounts got it wrong. But there are only a few details like this, maybe 2 or 3 in the resurrection narratives that are difficult to harmonize or to explain, giving the literary devices. But they wouldn't change the essence of the story.
Once again, I want to thank you, Dr. Mike, for agreeing to this interview. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. And it's been a great pleasure to have you here at the channel.
Thank you, Andrew. God bless you, brother, and your viewers. God bless you all, and thanks for having me on. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah. So before you leave, could you give some last word to those who see us or in the future apologies of Latin America?
Sure. We need a lot of apologists in Latin America. And so if you're interested in apologetics, people like Andrew, RZIM, down in Latin America, I'd say I've got a friend named Jorge and Juan Valdez that they come down to Latin America and lecture quite often. These are great resources. And, I'm happy to help via Skype and Zoom and do some of these things. I'm glad you're translating my materials, a lot of them. My big book on Jesus' resurrection was translated into Spanish last year. So, and that is out and available now. So I'm glad you're doing these things. We need you. So I can tell you that Christian apologetics is fun. And yes, there's some difficult questions. Yes, it requires a lot of work and study, and it's not meant for everyone. But if you feel called to it, then go for it, because it's a lot of fun and God uses it in amazing ways, and he can use you in amazing ways in a positive way to impact his kingdom.
Thank you, Dr. Mike. Bueno, amigos, muchas gracias por estar aquí viendo esta entrevista. Recuerden que si quieren ver un poco más de las entrevistas que estoy realizando constantemente, pueden seguirme en mis redes sociales como Imago Dei, que además trato de llevar la racionalidad de la fe cristiana a las demás personas que no conocen este lado intelectual del cristianismo. Y bueno, la próxima entrevista será con el Dr. Hugh Ross, así que estén atentos. Nos vemos.